Hello, welcome to the video on Caesar's Bello Gallico 5.35, where we have a problem with Sabinus and Coda being in a giant circle and being killed by a bunch of Gauls, and it's not looking good for our guys, as we'll find out in this passage. What I'll do is I'll explain the Latin really quickly. I'll go quickly through it because you can rewind, and then I'll read off a translation, and then I'll continue on to the next slide, which will be the next chunk of text. So rewinding and checking back is a good way to go here. Also remember that rereading is the best way to remember these things for exams and for the AP exam. So without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so starting off, we see quo praecepto ab eis diligentissime observerto cum quaepiam cohors ex orbe excesserat atque impetum fecerat, hostes velocissime refugiebat. And the next sentence, interim eam partem nudari necesserat, et ab latere aperto tela recipi. Now we have, to start off here, we have some agreement to work with, so we have quo goes to praecepto. We have, of course, our preposition here. We have an ism, so it's definitely a superlative, but then we have an e ending, so we know it's an adverb, even though it's superlative. And then observato is definitely a participle, so we have a p, and with this being in the ablative and this being in the ablative, we, of course, have one of those great ablative absolutes. Alright, we see cum, and we see cum is not followed by an ablative, so we have another clause. We got to start with cum as a clause. Now we have quaepiam. Quaepiam is one of those words that you decline the beginning half, so we see quae here, and that is going to be our ending, if you will, even though it's not exactly the ending, but then we see that it agrees with cohors. Okay, ex urbe, cohors of course is nominative, sorry. Ex urbe is a preposition. Excesserat, we see a pluperfect. Atque impetum fecerat, another pluperfect. So when we end our cum clause, we can say, well, we have a couple pluperfects in the cum clause. Note they're indicative, so we have a temporal clause when. Okay. Hostes velocissime, same idea with that issime. It's an adverb and it's also a superlative. And we see refugiebat in the imperfect there. Not too hard. That's our main clause at the end there. And so this sentence goes something like, with this command having been obeyed by them most diligently, when any cohort, it's quaepiam cohorts, any cohort had left from the circle and had made an attack, the enemies were retreating very speedily. In other words, every time, let's draw this here, if we have our circle, if we have one of these Roman cohorts, I'll do the Romans in red, if we have one of these Roman cohorts that wants to attack some Gauls, and they leave from the circle to do it, these enemies are going to kind of retreat with them. But what that's going to do is isolate the Romans out here. Okay, so it's going to be a bit of a problem. Let's erase this really quick. Alright, and then we have in our second part here, interim, which is an adverb, it means meanwhile. Eam goes with partem. Nudari, the ari ending, is a passive infinitive. Necesserat. Necesserat is an impersonal verb with necesse, which means we have, that's right, with an impersonal verb, a verbal noun infinitive. VNI. Now you'll note that this is a passive verb. Passive verbs can't take direct objects. That means we actually have an ACI. Now, you're like, well, ACIs can't be verbal nouns. Yes, they can. This is not an indirect statement. This is an ACI. It still has the accusative subject infinitive verb, except the whole thing is acting as the subject of necesserat. Okay? Not the direct object, which is what the indirect statement would do. Alright, so we see et, that means we're going to continue on. Ab latere aperto is, of course, our preposition. Latere and aperto go together. Make that a little neater. Okay, and then we have tela recipi. Now we see recipi again being a passive infinitive. Now, when that's the case, we can kind of say, well, that means that this et is actually connecting that and this whole thing, which is another verbal noun infinitive. And it goes something like, meanwhile, it was necessary that that part be vacated, nudari, and that doesn't necessarily mean vacated as much as it's like unprotected. And that weapons be received from an open flank. And when it means to receive weapons, it doesn't mean you're gaining weapons, it means they're being thrown at you. Alright, so what's happening is you are, by leaving, like we showed the Roman guys leaving the circle, what's happening then is this part that gets left here, that I just didn't read again, that part is now unprotected, because the whole point of a circle is that it kind of protects itself. Everybody's facing outward, so if one part leaves, that whole part is now unprotected. And what happens is that they who have just moved out from the circle, now here they are outside the circle, now they can be bombarded from the side by Gallic spears. So that's a bit of a problem. Okay, and note Caesar's wording, it is necessary. In other words, that this is going to happen. This is how you deal with the circle if you're the Gauls. You wait for them to do that so that you can bombard them. So Caesar's kind of like, he's talking about battle strategy here, but at the same time, he's kind of saying what happened. So he kind of knows exactly what would have happened even though he wasn't there. Alright, let's go to the next slide. Alright, so we start this one with rursus. Rursus is an adverb. It looks nominative. Let's not fall into that trap. If we know our vocab, we'll see that rursus is an adverb, and thus it cannot be the subject of the sentence. So I would just label it like I did there with an adverb label. So we have cum beginning a clause as it does in eum locum. Unde is an interesting word, because unde can either be an adverb or a subordinating conjunction. It can take a clause. So here I will tell you it's a subordinating conjunction, mostly because we have a verb here and we have verbs here without an and. So naturally we're going to probably lean toward it being a subordinating conjunction, and we'll end at our first verb. Reverti is a passive infinitive. Okay, so let's label infinitive there. And then koiperant. Koiperant comes from the word for to begin. Koipio, koipere. But anyway, it means to begin, and to begin naturally takes an infinitive. We end our cum clause, and we are happy. We have an et here. Ab eis. It's a preposition, but then we of course have qui. Okay, so qui begins a clause, and its antecedent is eis. Thanks Caesar for putting it right afterwards. This et keeps this clause going, or I'm sorry, it does not, because we have a another ab. So we have another ab eis, same construction qui with an antecedent eis. We see two different agents here, ab eis qui, ab eis qui. The ets here are then both and. So both by those who do this and by those who do this. They were circumveniebantur, surrounded, in the imperfect passive. Okay, so let us get started with a translation. Again, when they had begun to be returned into that place from which they had left. That's a fancy way, if we remember our circle. It's a fancy way of saying that they want to go back to their little spot right here in the circle. They are surrounded both by those who had withdrawn and by those who had stood close by. And these abeis qui, those are Gauls. Those are not Romans. Those are Gauls. Remember, surrounding Romans is what they're trying to do. All right, so moving on. Sin autem locum tenere velant, nec virtuti locus relinquebantur. Neque ab tanta multitudine coniecta tella conferti vitare poterant. All right, so we get started here. We see that sin. Sin is kind of a word. It's interesting. It's a little short like see, but it means kind of like but, if, and it kind of has that strength of if, like see. We know that it should probably take a clause, so we're gonna go for it. Sin autem. Autem is an adverb. Don't think it's an accusative. It means however. Locum, accusative. Teneres are infinitive, and then we have wellent from volo velle, to want. And of course we know that to want takes an infinitive, with a complementary infinitive, I should say. So there we go. And then we have nec virtuti locus relinquebantur. Nothing all that difficult there. Neque, so we have nec, neque here. That's a cool conjunction. Neither nor. Ab tanta multitudine. That's all a preposition, an ablative chunk. We see here a participle, a PPP. It goes with tella. But it's not an ablative absolute because tella is not ablative. Conferti. Conferti is another PPP, but it agrees with the NT, the they, because it's nominative plural. And there's no nominative given, so it agrees with that given they. It's actually taking the place of it, so that's Caesar's way of saying, oh, here's your nominative, but it's a participle. And then you have vitare, that's your infinitive, going with poterant. As you know, it takes a complementary infinitive, so we are good there. And this translation isn't that bad, so we'll just get going here. But if, however, they wish to hold their position, neither was a place of valor left. Now, note, before we move on with the translation, a place of valor. This is more a place for virtue. So we have here an odd dative. It's almost a dative of purpose here. That's kind of cool. A place for virtue was not left. Nor were they, having been crowded, of course the Romans, having been crowded, able to avoid the weapons having been thrown by such a great multitude. And we're talking, of course, about those guys that are surrounded, and we kind of talked it in the last slide about the ones who had gone away and have been surrounded now by Gauls. So we have a bunch of spears being thrown at them, as I'm going to draw with arrows because I can't draw spears. So there are so many Gauls throwing spears that they're not able to avoid them, and they're conferti, they're packed together. This is a lot of Romans here. A whole bunch of them. They're all packed in there. So it's hard to avoid them if you're so packed in. So the Gauls' spears are actually doing a lot of good for the Gauls, not for the Romans, because when you're throwing them into a packed-in army, that means they're more likely to hit somebody. All right. So Romans are in a lot of trouble. And let's see what's next. Tamen tot incommodis conflictati, multis veneribus acceptis resistebat, et magna parte die consumta, cum a prima luce ad oram octavam pugnaretur, nil quod ipsis esset dignum committebant. All right, here we see tamen. You guys know tamen as that word that goes with that cum, the concessional cum, the although cum, because it means kind of still or yet, making the force of like, although something's happening, this is still happening. So we have it's as an adverb, but we're kind of expecting an although cum. Tot, you guys know, is a little word. There's no U clause following, but here we have tot as a just like so many, and this is kind of an exclamatory. So it goes with incommodity, says it doesn't decline, but it is right next door, so we'll go with it. Incommodious is of course ablative. Conflictati. There is of course a participle. Let me write that in, a PPP. And of course, nominative plural. Again, just like in the previous passage, you have a nominative plural with an I ending, which is agreeing with that NT, those Romans that we keep talking about. They keep being the subject in those participles. All right, multis vulneribus acceptis. Here we have a combination of ablative nouns, an adjective, of course, and a participle, so we know that in the ablative with a participle is a giant A squared. And then we have resistebant, our main verb. Et magne parte, we didn't know magno was ablative until we got to parte, and then we see that it agrees. Dae, which is of course genitive, so I guess we can draw that arrow back to parte as well. And then consumpta, yet again we didn't know it was ablative until we knew that parte was ablative, so now we have yet again another ablative absolute. Okay. Cum. There's our cum. We said that Taman expects to have one of those although words, those concessional cums, and here it is, a concessional cum. And then we have a primeluke, which is of course a preposition. Ad oram octavam, another preposition. Good, it'll be easy to translate if we chunk it off like that. Pugnaretur, a word that isn't usually passive, but here, like, there was fighting. You have to translate it almost in like an impersonal. Okay, so we can kind of see how this is working. Nihil quod. Make sure we gap quod. Ipsis esset indignum. We have a linking sentence, so I have to go through indignum because we need that subject complement. And then committebant in the imperfect. You'll note that we have two main verbs. I'll do them in a different color. Let's try purple. Okay, we have a main verb here, resistebant, and then committebant is not in brackets. That's because this et right here actually connects these two verbs. Okay, so it's kind of neat. Let me erase that. I kind of messied it up a little bit, didn't I? All right, so remember our main verbs, resistebant and committebant. All right, so the translation goes as followed. Yet, having been troubled by so many disadvantages, maybe having been afflicted, conflictati, afflicted, I like that. So yet, having been afflicted by so many disadvantages, the incommodities are disadvantages, with many wounds having been received, they resisted. In other words, they were still fighting. And with a great part of the day having been filled, although there was fighting from first light to the 8th hour, they were doing, and that's an interesting word here, committebant. I wouldn't usually do doing here, but it's really the only thing that makes sense. Committing to, maybe. But I like doing here, and just doing a general word like that is going to make more sense here. They were doing nihil, nothing, quod, which was unworthy for them themselves. The ipsis, of course, them themselves, they themselves, has to do with Romans. They were doing nothing which was unworthy of calling themselves Roman, which is cool. It means we were fighting valiantly, even though our leaders made a big mistake, and now we're in an impossible situation. We are still fighting to the best of our ability, and we'll get a couple little personal stories here in a second. And actually, on that note, let us move on. Tum taito belventio, qui superiore anno primum pilum duxerat, viro forti et magnae auctoritatis, utrumque fermur tragula tricetur. Quintus Lucanius eastem ordinis fortissime pugnans circumvento filio subvenet interficitur. Now, oops, sorry about that. We have tum. Tum just means then. So he's going to here talk about a few people who he wants to give shouts out to. Tito Belventia. Now you're looking at this and you're like, well, where's their O endings? Well, this is a dative, interestingly. It means kind of we're talking about him. For him, for Titus Belventius. And then we have qui. Superioriano is, of course, something that agrees. Primum agrees with Pilo. I'm going to kind of jump over like that. And then duxerat, of course, our verb ends our qui clause. Viro forti, where you're like, well, it's dative. Well, we already had something that was dative, so that means that viro forti must be talking about Tito Belventio. Et magnae auctoritatis. Now, here we have something that agrees here, magnae auctoritatis, but these are genitives. And these are, of course, more modifiers. So we have this et here is connecting a modifier, forti, which modifies viro, right? It's muddying it up here. All right, so it's modifying viro, and magnae auctoritatis is also modifying viro. So we have a brave man and a man of great authority. Utrumque just means each, okay, and it goes with femur. Trongula is it's kind of an odd word. It just kind of means like a javelin. It's first declension, so we have a nominative or an ablative, and of course we have the word tricitur, which means to pierce, and it's in the passive. So we think that trongula, being a javelin, is probably not pierced. I think his femur, or his utrum femur, each femur, thigh, was pierced. And then this makes more sense as an ablative with a javelin. We'll get to the translation in a second, though. And then down here we have Quintus Lucanius in the nominative right away. Put a big S there for subject. Eusdem ordinis. Eusdem, of course, means the same. This is id plus dem. So eus is kind of what we're looking at. That's genitive and thus goes with ordinis. Fortissime, remember the superlative, and then the E ending is an adverb, which is cool. Pugnans is a participle with the NS. It's a PAP, P-A-P, present active participle. We're going to say that fortissime goes with it too. Dum, circumvento filio subvenet, bracket, interficitur. All right, let us translate. Then for Titus Belventius, who had led the first spear in the previous year. What does that mean, to lead the first spear? I looked this up. It means to be the chief centurion. Okay, so it's kind of cool. This guy was pretty high up if he was the first centurion. Not quite to like lieutenant level, but in the fighting, he was probably giving some commands, at least in the previous year. So, let me start over. Then, for Titus Belventius, who had led the first spear in the previous year, a brave man and a man of great authority. So, here comes the main clause. Each thigh is pierced with a javelin. Okay. Poor guy. And then we have Quintus Lucanius, of the same rank. Note the genitive there, of the same rank. Fighting most bravely, while he helped his surrounded son, is killed. This is kind of a specialty meaning of subvenio. Subvenio can mean literally to just come under, which doesn't make much sense here. But it also means to kind of like support or to help. So here it takes a dative, of course, as a compound verb, sub and venio. So we have that whole idea of like helping somebody, and that's his son. So we have this very Roman idea of family, where the dad is supporting the son as he is killed, which is kind of tragic yet still virtuous of him. So let's move on to the very last part of this passage. Lucius cota legatus omnes cohortes ordinesque in ad hortans in adversum os funda vulneratur. Very short sentence to end it up here. Lucius Coda, we've seen him many times. He's our subject, and of course his title is legatus, so that kind of goes with him. Omnes cohortes ordinesque, those are all accusatives. Going with ad hortans are P, A, P, yet again. So that means we have these are doppel, direct object of participle. In adversum os funda vulneratur. Alright, Lucius Cotta, the legate, urging on all the cohorts and ranks, is wounded by a sling. And this is kind of an odd translation. It kind of means direct in the mouth. It literally means into the direct mouth. It doesn't make much sense. So I think in English we have to kind of use our English idiom, directly in the mouth. In other words, some Gaul flung a sling and the rock hit him square in the chopper. So, yeah, that's gotta hurt. And that's how this passage ends. And unfortunately, all we know about Coda is that he has a giant bruise on his mouth, and that while he was using his mouth to urge on these guys, he's probably no longer able to use it. It's kind of unfortunate. But anyway, that wraps up this passage. I'd like you to note that even though they're being defeated, it's pretty clear that that's happening. They are going down with glory, and I think that the best description of that was in the last passage when we had Quintus Lucanius, who was helping his son while he died. So it kind of shows a tragic yet Roman end, where he keeps his virtue up to the last moments of his life. And I think Caesar is interested in doing that to show that the soldiers are not at fault and they're still good people. And I think it's going to help show Caesar as somebody who does care a lot about his troops, the individual troops. But anyway, that is it for chapter 35, and I will make more videos as I go.